Okay, so let's get back into it. Thanks for that, Mike. Okay, so we're just going to cover the basics today. This is the first session, and it will be, it applies across the board for both streams. So, first of all, just straight into it, what is generative AI? Well, it refers to artificial intelligence systems that can create new content, whether that's new text, new images, code, whatever it may be. And normally, this content is based on patterns learned from training data. So normally we would have, this traditional AI approach would have been analyzing existing data, so quite large amounts of data. They're very good at classifying information and making predictions. And some examples of these traditional AI systems would be things like your email spam filters and recommendation systems on YouTube or Spotify and things like that. But this new paradigm, this generative AI, has kind of changed things a lot. So this is more focused on creating new content, generating original outputs, and typically just responding to prompts. Examples of this would be ChatGPT and DALL-E, Claude. We'll look, later on at some of the various different tools, but just briefly, sorry, 2 seconds. So just briefly, we'll go over some of the common ones here. ChatGPT is probably the one you're all most familiar with. Writing emails, doing reports, things like that. DALL-E is another good one for creating images just from text descriptions. And we have GitHub Copilot if you want, a tool that's going to be good for suggesting code, writing documentation, things like that. Gemini is a good research assistant. It answers complex questions, but to be honest, a lot of the tools are now, becoming comparable when it comes to their ability to research. Claude is good for analyzing documents, and if you want some high quality writing, Claude's very good for that. Also, it's good for research, again, because of the amount of context that it can understand. Then we have things like AI music generators, where you can create original music and soundtracks. So when you put all of these together, pretty much every aspect of a business is starting to be, we can start to probably find a tool out there that can do some kind of automation for us. So why has this changed now? AI has been around since the 1950s, but it's really just some recent breakthroughs that have led to this. So some of the things that have changed, the amount of data was the first thing. So we didn't have vast amounts of data, in the past to train these systems. Computing power obviously has, advanced a lot. So this has made training more feasible. Instead of, taking billions of years to train these things, it can take us maybe just a year and a half. The architecture was a big one. The transformer architecture basically enabled the understanding of context. And this is, the T in ChatGPT. And of course, accessibility. So the user-friendly interfaces that, the likes of ChatGPT provided. We just had like a WhatsApp kind of chat interface. Made things really accessible. And then, of course, the big one was the billions invested in AI research from all the big tech companies like Google and OpenAI and Microsoft and all the rest. So when you put all of these things together, this is what where generative AI has come from. If you take out any one of these, we probably wouldn't be able to. Well, apart from maybe the accessibility and stuff, but the key kind of innovation was the transformer architecture. This really revolutionized, how the AI models generate text. So when we put all of this together, these new large language models are really starting to revolutionize how we do business. But before we get into that, we really need to talk about some essential terminology. So the first thing we have to understand are tokens. These are the basic atomic units that an AI model uses to process text. It's roughly equivalent to 4 characters or about 3/4 of a word. So if you had something like this, hello world, remember that the space is a character as well. So this would approximately be 3 tokens. Why does this matter? Why do we care about tokens? Well, all of these models will have token limits for input and output. And obviously, the more tokens that you use, the more that it's going to cost you, because the costs that are calculated per token. So if you use 10 tokens, then it'll cost you, let's say $1. If you use 100 tokens, that's going to be $10. So the tokens are very important to keep track of. Understanding these helps you manage long documents, and of course, keep your costs down as well on top of that. But it basically affects how much context you can provide to the AI. So if I have an AI model that can only take in 20 tokens, and if I give it 30 tokens, then I can't. It's not going to know what I'm talking about. So this leads us on to the context window. Whenever you hear this term, what does that mean? Well, this is essentially the amount of tokens that an AI model can take in and can put out. So your context window is both your input and your output. So your input, if you could think of an example where you want to get a model to assess or summarize a document, that document has to be chopped up into tokens, and then the tokens have to be put in alongside your prompt. So it's very, let's say if you had a context window that only had 100 tokens, but your prompt was taking up 60 of them tokens, then you're only going to have, the model's only going to be able to give you a short answer because it's limited in its context window. Some examples of previous, models and their context window length. We had ChatGPT 3.5 that had about 4,000 tokens. So that was about 3,000 words. GPT-4 then, it greatly expanded that. It went up to 128,000. So that was up to, maybe nearly 100,000 words. Claude was, the previous model was around 200,000. So you can see now where, Claude will be a lot better because it has a bigger context window. It's going to understand more documents. And then Google's Gemini was really the king for a long time, where it had up to 2 million tokens. So that's, processing 1.5 million words. So that's, if you think about this having the memory, the model has this amount of memory. Well, Gemini's Google would be able to take entire books of information and still give you out books of information. So the practical impact is just that the larger context windows will let you analyze entire books, multiple research papers, or long conversation histories at the same time. So it's essentially, you can think of the context window as the model's memory. Sorry, 2 seconds. Okay, so so this is essentially the memory, and this is going to limit, what your choice is when you're looking to choose some of these different tools. And of course, all of these different tools will have different costs for tokens as well. So, you need to understand about the tokens and the context window in terms of what the model can do for you, but also how much it's going to cost. So large language model, as you probably heard me mention already, these are just the generative AI models that are trained on massive data sets, and normally it's data sets of text. Large refers to billions of parameters, and at this stage, it's probably, on the order of trillions. Some examples of these large language models are ChatGPT's, ChatGPT-4, Claude, Gemini, Llama. There's absolutely loads of them at this stage. A prompt is just the way that we're going to interact with these tools. So this is the instruction or the question that you give, and the quality of the prompt will significantly affect the quality of the output. So prompt engineering is a skill in itself, and it's becoming more and more popular. But one of the easy ways that you can get around this is ask the LLM to give you a quality prompt for what you're looking. So sometimes it's good to actually use the large language models to prompt themselves. Training data is just the information that was used to teach the AI model, and this will normally include, depending on the model itself, but it'll normally include books, websites, code repositories. If it was, let's say, an image generation model, then its training data is going to be a lot of images. So these models will have training cutoff dates, and that's essentially it doesn't really know about any information after a certain point. Parameters are just the internal values that determine the AI behavior, and the more that we train a model, then that's how we can set our parameters, to basically do what we want it to do. So GPT-4 has an estimated, more than 1 trillion parameters. So this is quite a large neural network that is underlying this model. And then you might hear things like zero shot and multi-shot prompting. So this is just a prompt engineering technique where zero shot is usually, a single prompt with no examples, but multi-shot is where examples and output and things like that are provided, basically to get a better response. So the multi-shot is basically the best approach or a better approach than zero shot. Zero shot would be nice if we could just put in one prompt and get everything we want back out, but it's normally not that easy. Moving on to some more advanced concepts. So we have things like temperature. Whenever you're playing around with kind of more of the advanced features of these models, you'll hear some of these terms. So temperature really just controls the randomness or the creativity of your outputs. So if you put a lower temperature, you're going to get more focused, more consistent outputs. But if you have a higher temperature, then it's going to be more random and varied. Fine tuning is a process of specializing a model for specific tasks using, additional training data. So that'll be, the things like the music models or the image models, things like that. Hallucination we have to be aware of because these things do generate false and nonsensical information a lot of the time, and they do it very confidently. Because essentially what the model is trying to do is trying to give you an answer that it thinks is right, but it may not always be right. So you need to always verify, any information that you get from these models. Multimodal is another one that you'll hear, and this is essentially a model that can take in and process multiple types of data, whether that's text, images, audio. So some of the ones that we talked about already, where I can have a model that can give me text to speech and text to text and text to image. So that would be a multimodal because it can, cover so many different modes of input. So, sorry, this things do how do they process the information? So essentially, we start off with the training process. This is where massive amounts of text is gathered from typically the internet, so publicly available text. Then the model learns relationships between these words and concepts. What it does then is over millions of iterations, it will basically figure out these relationships, and then it will start to adjust the parameters until the relationships are optimized. And then typically what they will do with these companies will have some kind of human feedback, which will improve quality and safety. So this is reinforced human feedback. So essentially, when we put that all together, what happens then is, once we have these models created, we can put in our prompt. So it will process the input, and then it will give us some context. It'll basically get the context analysis, and then it will predict what the next word should be. And then it basically does this over and over. So it takes your whole prompt and it chops it up into tokens, and then it analyzes them tokens, and then it basically tries to predict what is the next token. So if you think about a simple sentence, like, uh, sorry, Yeah, bottom there, it's grand. Um, so the where was I again? Whenever we get to the uh, prediction, that just iterates over and over and over again. So if I had a sentence like, "The sky today is," this is how these models are trained. So it's basically given a partial sentence, and then it has to predict what's the next word, or what's the next token, or the next series of tokens. Because these models don't really understand what words are. Everything at the lowest level is a token. So it basically does this over and over and over again, and the output that you're getting, whenever you say to it, write me an email, a professional email. What it does is it'll do all of the context analysis, and then it'll predict what you want to see, and then it keeps doing this over and over, and then finally it will put that out. So it will. So your prompter turned into tokens. The model considers all the context and then predicts the next token, and it repeats this token by token by token, and then it converts whatever the output is. It converts that back into text. So it doesn't understand in the human sense. It recognizes patterns and it predicts the statistical likelihood, that this pattern is going to continue. So just from this, simple process of trying to predict the next token, you can see that the results can be, very, very remarkable and quite useful as well. So, what are some of the things that it does well? Because we have to remember that these things are not the silver bullet. They're not going to solve all your problems. But there are some things that they do well. So, content creation, writing emails, writing reports or articles, drafting proposals, things like that. Analysis and summarization, so summarizing key documents and comparing sources, extracting key points. Some of these things that might take us a very long time, to do manually, we can start to speed up the process with these tools. Coding as well. So writing code snippets or debugging code, these things are very, very good at debugging code and very good at creating documentation. And they're getting even better and better at the actual coding part itself. But there's still, there's key weaknesses in there, so you wouldn't allow these things to basically to code autonomously. They can be a good creative assistant for brainstorming, generating outlines, things like that. Even bouncing your ideas off. Research, if you have any research to do, they're very good at doing large amounts of research and answering questions, explaining concepts, things like that. And then translation as well, language translation and grammar checking, things like this. So very good for editing. So there basically is a tool for each, part of your work that you may be able to apply these things to. On the other side of that, though, there are limitations. So we need to watch out for a lot of things here. Accuracy is the big one. So they are getting better and better at this, but a lot of the time, if they don't have real-time knowledge, then they're not going to be able to give you accurate answers because the trained data has these cutoff dates. But also it can, and very often presents false information confidently, like it is correct. And even when you try to say that it's not correct, it can start to argue with you. So there are, accuracy issues there. There are limitations on their reasoning skills. So sometimes with complex math, it might struggle or it may miss logical inconsistencies. This is something that's very common and it can't verify facts independently. Now, there are ways that we can get around these limitations, but you just need to be aware of them. Bias is a big one as well. Normally, these models will reflect any biases that are in the training data. And unfortunately, there isn't a training data set out there that doesn't have any kind of bias in it. So these things actually will perpetuate stereotypes and things like that. And depending on, where the model may be trained, there might be varied cultural representation there as well. And of course, security and privacy is a big one. So you don't ever want to put in confidential data into these things. There are, There are cases where you might be able to do that, but you need to just be careful. Um, Outputs may be trained for future models, again, depending on the tool that you're using. And the data handling will depend on the provider. They are changing their terms and conditions all the time. So this is a very fast, evolving space. So you do need to keep on top of everything in terms of your security and privacy. So, what are some of the best practices that you can do? Well, verify important facts and figures. That's the basic, number one. You always want to use AI as a starting point, but not really the final product. They're not at that point yet. You can, start to build these AI tools and start to hook them together and start to actually create a final product, but you're never really, we're still not at that point yet. So it's always good to just use them as a starting point. You want to provide clear and specific prompts, and later on in the course, we'll give you some examples of some good prompts. You want to iterate and refine your requests, and also consider ethical implications. We'll also talk about that throughout the course. And the biggest one of all, and this goes along with verifying the important facts, is you have to maintain human oversight. Okay, so these things are not allowed to be running around by themselves. Now we've started to see a shift now where agents are becoming more popular, and these are essentially LLMs that can execute tasks. But again, even at that point, what you're going to do is have some human oversight, involved. What you don't want to do is blindly trust all the outputs, because you will be fooled if you do that. You don't want to share confidential information, definitely not with the free products. You don't want to use it for high stakes decisions. There are, limitations in the EU AI Act, for example. So there are, limitations in law and things that you can do, but you definitely can't use them for high stakes decisions. Plagiarizing without discourse, relying on AI for medical or legal advice, or assuming that AI understands like humans. Like I say, a large language model doesn't even know what a word is. It might, be able to. It'll be trained on it, and it'll be able to understand. It'll be able to tell you all of, everything that we understand about words. But at the end of the day, its currency is tokens. So it's understanding tokens and patterns between tokens. It doesn't understand things the same way that we do. It hasn't got that level of abstraction yet. So ethical considerations, obviously you need to cite these things whenever you're using them. And they can help you, with developing your institutional policies as well, but you need to, basically be transparent. So being transparent about your use is very important. This, increases trust, ensures quality and accountability, and you want to, focus on the impact on job roles and skills in a positive way, and but also look at the negative impact as well. We have to be realistic. There's also broader concerns as well, like for example, the energy that's used to train these models is colossal. And then there are copyright and IP questions. So again, there's a lot of there's some concerns around intellectual property, and this is going to depend again on the provider of the tool. So it's really up to you to stay informed about policies and when things change. You want to augment, not replace expertise. So these things are essentially going to, enhance your productivity, but they're not going to replace you. Um, you need to consider implications of the AI use as well, because if it's going to, make things worse, then you need to prepare for that as well. So this is an evolving field, very quickly changing. Even whenever I started to write these notes for this course, it has changed a lot since then. So some of the things that are starting to emerge are obviously more capable models with better reasoning. We see this all the time, almost monthly at this stage. The larger context windows. So it used to be that Google was the only one that had a big, large context window. But now they all have them. They all have around a million in their latest models. So a million tokens is a lot. You can do a lot with a million. Um, Most of the models now will have better multimodal capabilities. So I can put in, a large document, and I can get it to maybe give me an audiobook version of that document. Specialized models for specific industries. Again, we'll look more at that, in future session when we look at the tools. And improved accuracy and reduced hallucinations. There are ways that we can reduce hallucinations as well. But we can see that these models are becoming better and better because there's more and more data available. These researchers, these companies are working on them constantly to always try to iron out the problems with them. Some skills that you need to start thinking about developing would be good to have prompt engineering and be able to effectively communicate. Um, Critical evaluation of the outputs, understand when to use it and when not to use it, and then combining the tools with domain expertise. So that's to say, whenever you really start to become comfortable with these things, that's where the power is, when you can combine them together. So the landscape is evolving rapidly, so it's always best to stay informed and be ready to change to basically maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. So, flew through that. Five essential points to remember. So, GenAI basically creates new content. It's patterns learned from massive data sets, and it's fundamentally different from traditional AI, but it does have a lot in common in terms of training and things like that. Understanding terminology will help you. Understanding things like tokens, context windows, all of this kind of AI jargon that has come out. It definitely helps to understand what a lot of that means. It's powerful, but it's imperfect. Hallucinations and biases will always exist, so you need to always verify important information. And you have to be ethical in your use because, if you start to become unethical, you can be breaking laws. There's all sorts of risks involved with unethical use of AI. So we just don't want to kind of go down that path. And AI really, at the end of the day, should augment human capabilities. So it's really a tool to enhance human judgment and expertise, not to replace it. So, I would always say that if you've got a bad process in your business, then these tools are really going to just put that bad process on steroids and not really going to fix that process for you. Whereas, you might be wanting the tool to fix the process for you. But really what it's going to do is it's just going to, whatever you're doing now, it's going to amplify that. So it's really going to turn you into Superman, essentially. So there's a lot of additional resources. There's loads of resources on the cloud. So what I've done here is basically just created a lot of different standard operating procedures for a fictional company that create electrical panels. So if I click into, this is the first SOP, you can actually just see into the document here, and it gives you a summary of everything, the document's about. So I have 10 of them here, and in Notebook LM for the free version, you can have up to 50 sources. So you can do things like you can add websites, you can upload your own files, you can upload things from Google Drive, and there's loads, so you can see all the different file types that it will accept. It'll take PDF, Word documents, pictures, music, MP3. It'll take videos, MP4. So all kinds of documents. So I'm just going to go with these normal Word documents. So as soon as I put in the sources, what it does is straight away gives me this kind of executive summary. Okay. And as you can see, these documents establish a comprehensive set of SOPs that govern the entire life cycle of electrical control panel manufacturing, from initial component receipt to final shipment. So basically, I upload all of my sources, And in this way, I can basically restrict this chatbot from hallucinating because it doesn't understand anything outside this. Okay, and it's the underlying chatbot is Google's Gemini, but it's essentially being trained on my documents. Okay, or it's being told, don't ever, answer outside these documents. So things I can ask it is like, what's the lockout tagout procedure? And straight away, within a couple of seconds, it goes and it gives me the answer. But what's also really good is it cites where it got the answer from. So you can double check, is it actually getting it correctly? And you can see here, yes, that one. It has told me which document that one's in. And then I go here and I look again, that's in the same document. So it's just referencing different parts of the same document. But also, if my question, was relevant across different SOPs, then it would be able to cross-reference them. Okay, so you can see that it's really handy for having a knowledge base and actually just asking questions from that knowledge base. And again, this is a free tool. So if I created there's a couple of tools over here at the side. You can see Studio. So this audio overview, that's essentially turning all of these sources into a podcast type of media. And then I have things like Slide Deck. Well, Slide Deck I think is the paid version. But there's a couple of things like Mind Map and stuff like that you can get for free. So if I look at the mind map I created earlier, so you can see it's probably not great for an actual mind map, but I think it's really good for navigation. So if I want to navigate all of these really quickly, let's say I have some question on safety and compliance. I want to see which SOPs are involved in that. Let's say it is the lockout tagout procedure, and then I want to see energy isolation. So if I just click on this, you're going to see that over on the chat, it's essentially just going to give me a new prompt. As soon as I clicked on that, so I just want to navigate, it's good for navigation. So what's energy isolation, fundamental process, and so on and so on. We can double check again the citations. Yeah, brilliant. So it's really good for uploading your knowledge base. Let's say you did have, a lot of standard operating procedures, and then you can just start asking questions of that knowledge base, and it shouldn't really hallucinate too much anyway, because it's not going to really go outside these sources. There's other things you can do as well, like you can create a video overview, and they're pretty good. Like I say, not perfect, but not too bad either. So I'll show you like a little preview of a video that I created based on all of these. Yeah, I'll not go on for ages. But you can see, not too bad. Like it's good for putting all of this massive amounts of text into an engaging video, or audio podcast or something like that. Also, you have these infographics. Again, I think this might be for the paid version, but Google's it's fairly cheap, so it is. So you just click on a infographic, and it goes through all of the 10 SOPs and basically goes through creates this the journey of a control panel from parts to power. And I didn't put in any prompt for any of that. I just clicked these buttons. But if I wanted a specific infographic, I could put in the prompt in here, and it would start generating for me. And then of course, if you're happy with all of this, you can basically lock this in stone. You can, whatever your sources are, then you just basically share it with your colleagues, so you can start sharing. And again, it's free. So your colleagues can come in here once they have the link, and they can just start typing. They don't need to, re-upload any of this stuff. They don't need to recreate any of this stuff. They can just look at the work that you've already done, and they can use that work. So there's tools like that, that are really, really helpful, really useful. The one good thing about Notebook LM is that they don't use your data for training. Okay, because again, you need to be very careful about all of that stuff. You need to understand what they're going to do with your data before you ever start using any of these tools. Another example is Claude here. Okay, Claude is kind of Anthropic, the company behind Claude, they kind of position themselves as the data and the security kind of people. Um, Even though they kind of accidentally leaked their model last week, but they go for that kind of approach to encourage enterprise to use them more. So a lot of businesses would use this company. So if you look up here, you can see incognito. I go to that, and incognito chats aren't saved to history or used to train models. Okay, and then you can learn more about how your data is used. But again, you need to be very careful. A lot of these, like Google, for example, well, not Notebook LM, but if you're using other Google products, they'll just tell you straight. Once you upload the files to us, that's our information now. It's no longer just yours. So if you don't want to share, confidential information with these things, kind of treat them like they're public notice boards. So if you wouldn't mind putting it up on a public notice board, then you shouldn't have a problem with sharing that information. So anybody, any questions? Where are we? All of this stuff, a lot of it is already covered in the notes and stuff anyway, even that notebook demo and things. And if there are any questions, you should be able to post on this thing as well, post announcements and stuff, so you can talk to each other, or ask me questions, or whatever it may be. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the plan. And like I say, I'm going to leave all of this open, so I'd like to get your feedback. Um, if there's things that you think maybe that could be done better, or things that you think we've missed. And I do plan to update this quite a bit in the future, especially when it comes to things like these demos. A lot of this stuff becomes out of date very quickly. Um, a company might release a tool tomorrow that just makes this completely redundant. That's been happening quite a lot. You think that you put a lot of work into something, then all of a sudden a company will come out and already have it done. But yeah, that's essentially what it is. Just after today, you just work away at your own pace. Kevin, I will upload the video from today's session up here, okay, onto the Google platform. Lovely. Okay, everyone, that's pretty much it. Yeah, if you do have any questions or anything, you can post them up on the classroom, and anytime that I do any changes or anything, you should automatically get notified of that through your Gmail. All right, thanks for coming.